And welcome everyone to Writing Doctor Who. It's discussions showcasing the many aspects of writing Doctor Who, from the television series to plays, comics, target novelizations, audio dramas, and more. I'm Kathryn Sullivan. I'll be moderating this panel, and I'll have our panelists introduce themselves, starting with Stacey.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. So my name is Stacey Smith. I enjoy writing Doctor Who. I enjoy other people's writing of Doctor Who. I'm a Doctor Who, I guess, nonfiction writer and editor. So I write things like Who is the Doctor? I wrote that under my old name, Robert Smith, with Graham Burke, although now I go with Stacey Smith. And I'm also editor of the Outside In series, which might segue into the next person.
And Arnold.
Hi, I'm Arnold Blumberg. I run ATV Publishing, which publishes that Outside In series that Stacey is editing. So yes, it worked together perfectly. And I've also had the opportunity to write a little bit of Doctor Who via Big Finish's Short Trips books that they did way back when, which was one of the proudest moments I ever had. So it was a pleasure to add a little piece to the history of everything.
And Gordon?
My name is Gordon Domowski. I am a new pulp writer. I have yet to write for either Outside In, and I have many rejected Big Finish script competition entries. So I'm looking forward to that. But I'm also the organizer of the Chicago Doctor Who meetup, and I have an interest in the writing of Doctor Who.
And we're waiting to see if the YouTube is working. Okay.
Oh, it's live.
Yeah, it's good. Good. And again, I'm Kathryn Sullivan. I've written a couple of short stories in some of the short trips. I've got essays in Chicks Dig Time Lords, Outside In, and Children of Time, Companions of Doctor Who. And so, where do you want to begin? Shall we start off with, you want to start off with this television series? You want to start off with all the spin-offs?
Well, let's start with the core, with the TV show.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So starting off with writing the show, what do you want to address on the core of writers? You want to address the history? Okay.
So I think for me, like, Doctor Who comes out of a stage kind of tradition, right? Because early TV you couldn't do much, right? So early TV was basically, it's a stage play where you're pointing a camera at it, right? And so you had to have all the sort of construction in the writing built for that. Like, for theater, you can't have big special effects and you can't have massive locations and costume changes. You have to have basically very limited stuff. And, if you're going to change something, you've got to build that in, there must, you're going to have intervening scenes between so people can get changed. And even early Doctor Who was filmed basically as live with a few inserts and stuff like that. So I think the generation of early writers you have, basically had this idea of, I have to create the whole world essentially through writing. And I think one of the joys of Doctor Who, which actually my first girlfriend who hated Doctor Who, she showed her in the 90s, she's like, this show is terrible. And then she was mocking it, and her mockery, what she said, it's like they take 3 British character actors and they stick them in front of a black screen and they try and convince you it's an alien planet, and oh God, they actually do, don't they? And so I'm like, that's why I love it. And so I'm like, and I think that the thing is that the writing is what really pulls you through there. It basically is a bridge between what you can see on the screen and your imagination.
Which is what they had to do back in that time period. Arnold?
Yeah, I mean, it has a lot of the trappings, at least initially, and for a long time, I think, in British television, like Stacey is saying, in the same way that if you revisit old golden age of TV in America, is that same thing of every medium behaves like the previous one for a while. It's so it was both radio and stage. Television was limited. It didn't have a grammar of its own yet. And in many respects, British television sometimes seems like it's a little behind historically with where things were production-wise. And so it often looks like that, simplistic, like a shot stage play. And I think, like we've talked about over the years, all of us who have been involved in this for so long, it's part of the charm of it as well. And arguably, it's why the writing is so important, because the writing has to carry so much more. There's not going to be the kind of extraordinary production that now, of course, in a certain respect, they can accomplish on the show in the modern era. So writing had to be superb, character had to be prominent, and of course, obviously, acting had to sell it. So in some ways, it was a writer's show, because it really didn't have the bells and whistles that a lot of things would have later on. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons we love it so much.
And Gordon?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed with Doctor Who is when you look at the classic series and the new series over time, it tends to integrate various not only influences, but it seems to, but there's an evolution where you see the strength of the writing. It's I think, like many fans, Doctor Who was the first show where I actually took the time to know learn who the writers were. I mean, you can see, everything from classic literature in the Baker era to the Pertwee era that may or may not have been influenced by Star Trek, which was being shown in the UK around the same time as it was being produced. So there's this very rich ability to, no matter what the production design is, you can always see where it's a unique story, but you can kind of see where they grab little bits and pieces from, and you can see what kind of influenced it. And that's what makes it enjoyable for me, is it takes these different ingredients and mixes them up and creates various really rich stories.
You could tell a lot of times from the writers where their influences are coming from. So like you had the horror films being influenced, you had all the science for the science fiction films. And then when you actually, and as much as people complain about the special effects and how cheap they were cutting edge for that time. And of course, the contrast between the special effects came really into play when you actually got Star Wars coming out. And then people started really complaining about the special effects, totally forgetting about the fact that special effects in Britain, that's where Star Wars was filmed. So they had access to some of those.
I have to say, I hit this point in like maybe early 2000s where I just stopped caring about bad special effects in TV, especially Doctor Who and stuff like that. Whereas we used to mock it in the 90s or whatever. And I think once we got that out of our system, then I was like, I just don't care. Actually, I was showing I'm showing the new series to a later girlfriend, and she said, "Oh, I really like Cybermen. Is there any like classic series with Cybermen that I can watch that I think And then she said at the same time, I really I want to see like really violent Doctor Who. Like she's like it's such like like light violence. Like show me something that's like kind of violent and with Cybermen." I was like, okay, well, Attack of the Cybermen is clearly what you're asking for. I showed her that, and she loved it because she's like, "Oh my god, they're all practical effects. I never see this. I used to watching CGI." So she was like, "This is incredible." I was like, "This is not what I was expecting for Attack of the Cybermen." But yeah, I think that like the special effects are what they are in the moment, and that really tells you about what's happening in that particular slice of time. But I think it's the writing that makes you remember it. This is what makes it sticks in the public consciousness for decades. And like other stuff comes and goes, but I think things like Doctor Who, if you have the depth, like where it's actually well written and stuff like that, is what keeps you floating. One of the interesting things that I've sort of like realizing recently was because each episode was only shown for like one episode per week, and then you have 6 days go by before you like see the next one. In each episode of each whatever many part story, you have to explain what the plot was for the previous ones, right? And you have to put that in the script, into the story, because you have no ability at the time for people to watch all at once. And I think sometimes we watch a story now, we're like, oh well, it sort of seems a bit samey or a bit repetitive. It's like, no, that's a feature, because you couldn't guarantee that anyone had seen episode 2 when you're showing episode 3. You've got to bring them up to speed. And sometimes the way that writing is done is actually really subtle. It's we only really notice it when it's done badly, and most of the time it's done really cleverly. That like the Brigadier throws in a little line, and you're like, oh, that's bringing all the viewers up to speed, but really, really neatly. When you especially get a really talented writer like Robert Holmes or Malcolm Hulke or something, they really have that on point.
And the fact, like with Robert Holmes, he did a lot of the double acts, so you always had two characters playing off each other. Sometimes they were just background characters, but it added so much to the story. You actually believed that there was a whole world or culture behind it.
There's a bit of that Greek chorus kind of effect. Yeah, giving a chance for the audience to get. Another thing too is, and I think it's ever more important today to point out these things because we're fighting so much ignorance about it, is how socially and culturally relevant the show has always been to a certain extent. More so with certain writers than others who felt motivated to tell stories that would suit the era. But say what you will about effectiveness or quality, but everything from the current era and shows that are causing a lot of controversy to go back to the classic era and find things like The Green Death, for instance. And you have a lot of awareness that as silly, as crazy, as wild as Doctor Who can be, as much as it can go to, and I see like in the chat, any genre, it can explore almost any kind of subject matter. It was also always coming back to stories that could often resonate with the present and what's going on. I mean, let's face it, 70s British television is just obsessed with mining and political issues that were going on there and then. And I had to learn some things as an American fan to quite figure out, okay, that's what they're talking about, And some of that stands the test of time and is evergreen in its environmental discussion and about ecology or about fairness, all kinds of things. So I think the other thing too is we talk about special effects. Doctor Who is often dismissed for silly special effects, or sometimes also, oh, it's that whimsical show about traveling around time and space. It is still a very relevant show, and the writing has often been extremely sharp on making commentary about our society today. And it's another reason why I think it deserves a lot of respect.
Yeah, and I think the classic series also did. The only thing I can equate it to are a lot of dramas like LA Law, where there's always the big important lesson at the end, where whereas I think Doctor Who's stories like The Sunmakers, where it's a satire on the British tax system, where it ends with a bunch of people throwing the grand space accountant over the roof and cheering. Or even when you look at the Cartmel era, when you look at stories like Paradise Towers and Survival, that maybe didn't, or even Remembrance of the Daleks, that, there was a thread through them that I know a lot of people, some people consider the modern series indoctrination, but I think there's always a thread of understanding. And I mean, the whole ethos of the show is about being kindness and being right and being gentle. And I think when you look at the overview of the entire series, especially the classic series, it comes through, but it's never really overt. And that takes a lot of cleverness on the writing.
I mean, when Andrew Cartmel was interviewing for the job, the script editor, like I said to him, what would you like to do with, as script editor Doctor Who? And he said, I'd like to overthrow the government. And he wasn't joking. Like, this was really serious. And the idea that you could think of Doctor Who writing as a vehicle to do that is quite amazing, actually. So, I agree. I think there's through that McCoy era essay, there's a lot of like very, very kind of angry kind of like, polemics sort of happening about like the state of the world. And like Arnold says, it's evergreen, right? These issues don't go away, sadly.
Do we want to move on to, let's see, we got plays, we got target novelizations, audio dramas, your choice. What do you want to move on to?
I guess it'd be interesting to talk a little bit as a segue to that then about how do we think there are any different approaches? Does Doctor Who transform when you have to write it for a different medium or something? Obviously the answer is yes to a certain extent with all of them. And I mean, Stacey, I know we've explored a lot about the books and like the bookworm and stuff, but audios, everything like that, you're translating something, and Doctor Who is considered to be a format that is so flexible and so adaptable. It's probably another reason why it stands the test of time. But obviously, as a writer, you still have to think about the format that you're writing in, the medium that you're writing in. And maybe we talk about what we think about how Doctor Who changes from television to audio or to novel form, that sort of thing.
I mean, the first adaptation was moving to movies. So you had the Peter Cushing movies. And I'm sorry, I'm one of those people who first came to Doctor Who because of the movies. And that caught me right there. It was, again, the storyline and the character development. and not the flashy special effects. So how did you feel that it went on?
So I think one of the interesting things, if you see, I read a lot of the novels in the 90s and so on, and reading the past Doctor adventures, like some Doctors do much better as novels, like in novels than other Doctors. And so what you sort of realize is some Doctors are writer-proof, and I think the Seventh Doctor was one of them, and that's why I think the New Adventures did very well, because they just happened to have a Doctor that was basically didn't rely on his actor to kind of like flourish. Whereas the Fourth Doctor is an incredible character, but like you take Tom Baker away, and it's really hard to replicate. It's really, really difficult. So he falls very flat on the page. And the Fifth Doctor is a very subtle character that Peter Davison is doing a lot of stuff with all the time, but there's not these kind of like easy things to grab onto. Whereas like the First Doctor or the Sixth Doctor, who are maybe not necessarily the ones you would go to think of like the most popular ones, they're amazing on the page because they really have these sort of very bombastic kind of like like characters, almost caricatures as part of their characters that you can just kind of put down and translate. So yeah, Arnold, I think you're right. It's obviously it's different, but I think what's interesting is how it's different in different ones, because audios, of course, you do have the actor, so if you're writing, the Fifth Doctor, you still got Peter Davison, so you're not divorcing the character from the writing a bit because of the actor being there.
Although another interesting aspect of that is how they've all gotten older. So you are changing the writing, and I mean, someone who's done that a lot would be able to speak to that a lot more, I'm sure. But like the Peter Davison we have in Big Finish is not the guy who is on television, and of course we've all heard the thing about how Colin Baker's Doctor has really been like rehabilitated and saved, through Big Finish. And it's like they're all older, they're more seasoned, they're coming at it with the knowledge of everything that's come before, but also the writing for them eventually has to be a bit different. And to be honest, I haven't listened to enough to really get a sense of what that would be, but someone who really has delved into those could probably say, here's how that Doctor has changed, in Big Finish compared to television.
Well, I actually have heard quite a bit of Big Finish. So I think one of the key things with Big Finish is that you're also dealing with writers who, the Fifth and Sixth Doctor, especially the Sixth Doctor era, have not really had strong writers. And you can argue that the writers of Big Finish kind of looked at maybe what was lacking and be able to address them. Like Colin Baker has moved from the, on television, the TV Colin Baker, the TV Sixth Doctor was maybe a bit over the top, but the Big Finish Sixth Doctor has a strong moral core. And when he stands his ground, he's standing his ground. The Fifth Doctor has a little bit more kind of oomph to him. It's I'm thinking of Spare Parts, where you wouldn't necessarily think of the Fifth Doctor in a Genesis of the Cybermen type story, but it works because he's the vulnerable Doctor who just realizes, I'm here, I should stop this. I'm not sure if I should stop this, but I got to do something, which you maybe couldn't quite see. It's the same Doctor. It's essentially the same Doctor who said, oh no, we can't go back for Adric. So you kind of have that, but there's that real sense of the Doctor's character has developed.
Which I think you need in an ongoing series, right? If you're, otherwise what's the point? If you're just churning out the same thing again and again, month after month, right? It's not that interesting. And of course, you don't want to completely radically change it to something unrecognizable. But if you can walk that line, of course, you would like to see actual character development happening on some level. And yeah, I mean, I think that any writing is going to do that. You're going to have to deal with stuff that kind of, in some sense, moves forward.
And we have a question in the chat from Eleanor, who basically asks, what makes Doctor Who so good? What are tips for writers wanting to write content that's good?
Oh, that's several panels in a row.
Yeah, it is. And if we knew the secret, we'd be rich.
I think the answer to what makes Doctor Who so good is the fact that it regenerates. And so, both on camera, obviously, but also behind the scenes. And so what happens is you sort of have these little islands, right? Of like, okay, on this island for now, we're doing this kind of a show. And you have these producers and these writers and these actors and so on. And they're making one thing that they sort of make. And so you get used to that for a while. And then before it gets too stale, they rip that away and they throw on a new island, and it's totally different. And it's a different, not only different actor, but it's usually different producers and different writers and so on. And so you get this continual refreshment. And that to me is what really allows it to sustain itself, indefinitely. And actually, I think Arnold, you were talking in the pandemics panel about like in another 100 years, we'll still be making Doctor Who. And I was like, I absolutely believe that. And I don't think I would have believed that maybe 15, 20 years ago in the wilderness years. But now I really do. I think that this is a show that will outlive all of us.
Yeah, I think so. And as part of that person's question about tips for writers wanting to write content is good. I mean, it gets very trite, but I mean, really the answer to that is the same thing you'd say about any writing course, I think, about, you still ultimately write something that pleases you first, that you find entertaining. You need to focus on character and making sure the story develops naturally. And I mean, it's all the things you would say about writing anyway. And obviously, we're talking about a show that has such flexibility, such a huge history, that we have seen so many different approaches. And yet ultimately at the core of it, it's these characters that we love. And really, when you boil it down to it, it's like maybe 5 or 6 different stories. It's like that's fine. That's the way it is. It's Base Under Siege. It's those kind of things. You're not really going to get hugely different stuff. You're going to go to a different genre and say, let's do that one. But it's really, I think it starts from character and from really developing a relationship between the audience and those characters that you love. And if you can write something that brings those characters to life, then that's the kind of thing that's going to entertain not just yourself, but your audience, your readership, whoever that might be. And that's a good start, I think, for writing content is good.
Yeah, and I would also suggest not just write and learn from your writing. For Doctor Who specifically, there's a great podcast called Doctor Who: The Writer's Room. They covered the entire of the classic era. They also did Outer Limits and Sapphire and Steel. Then they're working on the new era, because the more you can think about these stories critically and be able to pull apart and see, it's the evergreen insight into classic Who is a 6-parter, is a 2-parter, and a 4-parter. Like Seeds of Doom is 2 episodes in the Antarctic, 4 episodes chasing after Harrison Chase. Look at different writers who write for the show, see what they do that's effective, and see what they do that maybe you can improve on. Because I think understanding the nuts and bolts of writing, and there's no easy formula for it, allows you to go, okay, here's what I can use, and here's what I can throw away, and here's what I can add.
And we've got another question by Sebastian, who's asking, can you talk about writing in the Chibnall era and address why it feels so different from the other writing in the new series?
I think this touches on like larger issues about conversations about the show today. We probably don't have time in one panel to cover. Well, in a certain respect, I don't really see where it's all that different. I think a lot of the statement about it being different comes down to other issues. But I think really Chibnall's telling a lot of this, and all the other writers telling a lot of the same stories, and still feels like Doctor Who to me. I've been very vocal about how I think it's the best the show has been since like 2010, but I don't think it's all that different. I think if you want to say what's the different part is the overlay on top of having the first woman in the lead, and then maybe a bit more, not nearly as much as people complaining about it think, but a bit more of a deliberate attempt to be more socially relevant than maybe the show has been in the past in an overt way. Like I was saying before, it's always been there. You can't be a human being writing a drama and not comment on things. It's just inherent. You're going to do that. The question is how overtly you do it. And I think the show has become a bit more deliberate in doing that, whether it's about environmental issues or racism through Rosa or things like Demons in the Punjab, and like a bit more deliberation in doing it. And frankly, I feel at this point in time in our history, a bit more deliberate action on that side is necessary and desperately needed. So, the word indoctrination came up before. Is a great point, because it's only really considered indoctrination if you're the person that doesn't want what's being said. It's not indoctrination to tell people, as Gordon was saying before, to be kinder, to be more inclusive, to be more accepting of other people, to be more human. That's not indoctrination, but it sure is if you hate people. So, That's where I think the difference is. And otherwise, I think the writing has actually gotten better in a lot of respects. The subtlety of character in the Chibnall era, I think. If there's one, and I'm sorry it takes so much time. One thing that I would complain about the Chibnall era, the one thing I hate that he seems to write all the time, or that he tells them others to write, is this thing he does where he'll deliberately introduce you to a character and make sure in the 2 minutes you meet them that they have family that love them, so that when they die in another 3 minutes, you'll care. And I hate the hurtfulness of that for no reason. There's that old man in the guard station. Was it a woman who fell to earth? I'm thinking of, who we just find out he's a grandfather just long enough so that he dies. And it's like, oh, but his grandkids. And they did that twice in Revolution of the Daleks. That I can't stand, because it's needlessly hurtful. But that's my only complaint.
Okay. Yeah. This is where I get to tell Arnold that he is completely wrong. I do think there's a difference in styles. And this is just my perception. When you look at Russell T Davies and Stephen Moffat, you, at least from my perspective, you have two different people who they seem to have an idea of what Doctor Who is. With RTD, it's very strong character-based drama. With Moffat, it's a little bit more in terms of plot and some of the more, expanding on the ideas of time travel. You can like either era, you can dislike either era, but I think I have two small issues with Chibnall. One is I'm not really sure. Chibnall's Doctor Who feels very perfunctory. Not to deny that there's some actual writing talent. For me, it feels very much like with RTD, you get something with a little extra. Moffat, you get a lot extra. With Chibnall, it's kind of like you want 10 episodes of Doctor Who, you get it. I think his efforts to diversify the writer's pool is good. But I think Chibnall also suffers from Stephen Moffat diseases in that he doesn't really let his writers breathe. Like using Rosa, that was written by Marjorie Blackman, who's a woman of color. She's a young adult author. But it also has a co-writing credit by Chris Chibnall. And, I always look at it as there's a great story about the inevitability of history and racial issues, but it's interrupted by the subplot about space racist. I think the writing has gotten better. I think part of it might also just be, to be fair to Chibnall, it may just be that he's walking in where he's given a different set of number of episodes. They're longer, and there may be politics involved where maybe he's in a position where he has to have that heavy hand in terms of control. Whereas I kind of feel my rule about showrunners, and this is just my preference, is do the first episode, do the last episode, and let everyone else write in between. And then you have a really good series of Doctor Who. And you don't have to worry about people complaining that it's indoctrination, because it's quite honestly a show that features an alien race that raises one arm in the air and exterminates people. That's social commentary. Can't argue.
Stacey?
Cool. So yeah, I've got to take a different position from both of you, because I think that, first of all, I'll just say, I don't think there is any kind of this showrunner gets Doctor Who, this does it. It's just different, right? If Doctor Who wants to be procedural for a while, more power to it, right? It's just a different thing. And I think with the different showrunners, you just have different thumbs on the scale in different directions. Russell T Davies, like you say, really cares about character and drama and kind of this soap opera-ish thing. It doesn't really care about tying up his plots in a perfect bow at the end, right? It's like, oh, we can wave a hand and magic will happen and it'll be over, right? And that is either perfectly fine or deeply frustrating, depending what perspective you're coming from, right? And you might say, oh, I wish that was a bit better, but wow, that character drama is so great. Or you might say this is a complete betrayal of the script, and so you can equally say this guy can't write, or this guy's a genius who just doesn't finish things properly, or whatever, right? And I think with Stephen Moffat too, he's really interested in kind of timey-wimey plots and so on, and yet less interested in say ancillary characters, right? Everything is very small cast and usually the main cast and so on. So all writers have their strengths and their weaknesses. I think when it comes to Chibnall, it's just a different style. I would also say too, in terms of the writers and writer credit and so on, they did things they had the plan for the writers' room that we're going to do for series 11, and it completely fell apart because Doctor Who was a really, really hard show to write. right? And the idea that you can just take a young adult author and just, basically write it in script form, it doesn't work for Doctor Who. I actually think it was really, really clever of Chibnall to basically take a co-writing credit on that, because the story to be told was great, right? And it needs to be told, and it needs to be told by the Marjorie Blackburn. But like, if you don't have the experience of writing for TV, how do you gain it? And the problem is it tends to fall back on people who have that experience. And this is a way to kind of leapfrog someone over. And yes, you might say, well, sure, there's like this ancillary stuff that maybe doesn't feel like it belongs there. On the other hand, Doctor Who is also a show for everyone. It's a family entertainment show, which is a really hard thing to do, because you're writing on so many different levels at once. You've got to entertain children and keep them, interested and excited. You've got to make adults kind of pay attention. It's, everything's happening at once. So it's a really difficult show. The fact that it works so well most of the time, I think, disguises the fact of how difficult it really is to write the thing. And so I think that also, Chibnall won't be around forever, just as, Moffat wasn't around forever kind of thing. Like, eventually other things will come along. As far as the indoctrination thing goes, I mean, my view is always like, we can stop having stories that say war is bad when we've solved war. Right? To say, when these issues are solved, then it's cliched and so on. Until we've figured these things out, like, we need more stories of them because we haven't learned our lessons. And I do agree that I think metaphor is really great. Like, the Daleks as a metaphor is excellent. Although, I think one of the key points though is, the Daleks didn't arrive for like a decade and a half after the war, right? So that's where we have a lot of perspective, and we look back and go, oh yes, okay, I can really see that. If you were doing the Daleks in 1945, it's a different story you're writing then. Right.
And the only thing I'm going to chime in is that all three of those men are fanboys. So they were writing, thinking of this all their lives. Now they finally are showrunners. So they're going to put in what they always wanted to put in. Ultra Matt is asking, and Arnold, I think you will want to reply as well as myself. How would you say writing Doctor Who in short story format different than writing in other formats? Well, for one, you've got a limited word count, so you can't go overboard on descriptions and throwing in extra characters. Arnold, what would you say?
I agree. And of the two times I've gotten to do it officially, the first time was, well, they're both for the Big Finish Short Trips collections, and both times worked with a great editor. In one case, it was exactly that. I was writing like a 6 Doctor Perry story, and I had the 4-parter in my head, but I needed to cut an entire subplot out because there was no way we were going to be able to do that. And that's the way this works sometimes. It's actually, there's something to be said for short story structure kind of being more like you're doing a joke setup with a punchline than in a longer form, because you need to get to the story points you want. You want to make those characters really come off the page and, engage the audience, but you can't really go nearly into the level of depth or development. And a short story should feel like a very satisfying slice of whatever it is you're exploring. And it was kind of interesting because it was a little bit tricky where you realize, oh, wait, you can't really do the whole thing, in that kind of word count. But it was also a great lesson too, and how the elements of Doctor Who that are important, that you can still retain, and that you focus more on those. And yeah, so I agree with you completely about that.
Actually, I wrote one of those as well. I wrote a Big Finish, one of the History of Christmas ones too. And yeah, I agree. I think that, the shorter it is, the harder it is in some ways. It's funny because I was looking into, I wrote a Black Archive on Doctor Who and the Silurians. And one of the chapters was basically like, is this story too long? Right. And so, I was thinking a lot about story length. I was like, well, it feels like it's 7 episodes, you binge watch it in 2.5 hours or whatever. And it does feel like it drags a bit. On the other hand, if you start to think about how the story breathes, you kind of realize you need that length. And one of the great arguments for that is they redid that story many, many, many times. So you've got the Sea Devils, you've got Warriors of the Deep, you've got like Hungry Earth and Cold Blood, and you've got various novels in the 90s and so on. This story basically has been retold, and most of the time in much shorter form, and it doesn't work nearly as well. And Hungry Earth, Cold Blood is still one of the longer stories in the new series, and yet it's only the equivalent of a 4-parter, whereas Silurians is 7 episodes. And with the 7 episodes, you really get time to kind of world build, right? Even though it's our world, but you understand, who the players are, what's at stake, and also you go back and forth a lot, right? So the arguments between the humans and the Silurians, they basically ramp up over course of weeks, right? And you feel like you're solving one, and then a new thing comes up, and so on. So by the time it kind of basically escalates to like one side releases a plague, and then the other side is like committing genocide, like this this is earned. Whereas if you kind of just cut to the ending, really, which is basically what Hungry Earth Cold Blood does, it doesn't have the power of it because you haven't spent the time layering and layering and really caring about these characters. And so I think like, yeah, if you have more length, in some ways you have more power there. So writing something really short it's a tough call because you got to do a lot of work in a short amount of time.
Gordon, any thoughts?
I think there's really nothing I can add to this, so I'm in agreement.
Okay. Another question we've got is, how do you think budget affects the writing, whether classic, new Who, or spinoff?
Well, I mean, I guess most of us, if not all of us, we obviously love the show enough. We all know a lot of behind the scenes stories and delve into like the history of the making of the show too. And it's absolutely, I mean, there's no denying it's absolutely 100% true. Budget affects writing enormously because if you're writing, particularly in television, if you're writing or movies, if you're writing, you want to tell the story, but there's also the reality of you're writing to create a product that is going to be released, whether it's to theaters or to air on television, and it has to hit a mark, and there are accountants somewhere in that corporation who are paying attention to all that. And you might have a great story, and then they say, oh, by the way, you know what? We lost that location, so you need to rewrite the entire third act so it takes place in the same set that you're in, and now you got to figure that out. And in fact, there was a great thread recently. I can't remember who wrote it. There's a great thread on Twitter recently of somebody who's a showrunner on several shows. And she did this really long thread of, here's all the stuff that you encounter when you're writing for television. And if you can't roll with any of this, rethink your plans professionally. And it was stuff like that. It was like, guess what? One of your main stars is sick this week. Rewrite everything so that you can use it for your guest stars, but you need to use the same set and you need to have it done in an hour and all those kind of things. So ultimately, it budget affects it in every way. And then the only question is, how do you balance the need to try to tell an entertaining or informative or complex story, but do it within the constraints you're given because of the realities of production? And a clever writer, a talented writer, has to learn to roll with that. And you could also argue that many times you get those happy accidents where maybe because something like that changes, you wind up strengthening your story because you realize, oh, wait, you don't really need that to make this work. Mm-hmm. So sometimes budget actually inspires better storytelling. So it's all a question of who's doing it and how you adapt to those kind of situations.
Yeah, and I think in the classic series as well, when you consider that Doctor Who maybe had a budget equivalent to a soap opera and a half, especially 70s period Doctor Who, where early 70s are experimenting with CSO to stretch out the budget. But when you consider that, early Tom Baker, a lot of, you see the production value. And even with the Graham Williams era, even though there were strikes and everything else going on that could have sabotaged the production, the fact that you could make consistent television in that manner where you don't see a special effect fall apart in the middle of an episode. I mean, I think that takes a lot of effort. Or even in the new series, when you consider that Tennant's second season, a script fell out and you got Fear Her. Now you can argue whether that's a good script or not. I think it's very underrated, but being able to do that on the fly with no specs, or to do Midnight, which is basically one set because another story fell through, being able to see that, yeah, they were able to accomplish that with a very minimal budget is always impressive. And it's easy to mock, oh yeah, wobbly sets, everything else, but being able to put on a consistent show over a period of time takes a lot of effort. And it's good with Doctor Who that you can write in a way that you make every dollar count.
And a good example from the classic series was Greatest Show in the Galaxy, when you basically had the stride action, and they were forced to put a tent up. And
in the car park, yeah.
It worked.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to say one of the things about the classic series, though, is I think they they worried a little bit less about the budget than they do in the new series, in the sense of like, sometimes they would just attempt things that were incredibly ambitious and sort of say, well, we'll just kind of hope for the best. Whereas I think in the new series, there's a little bit of caution of like, I don't think we would attempt that because it's going to look terrible, right? So they're actually a bit more, like Arnold said, like constrained by the budget in that sense. And in a sense, you have a probably better sense of what will and won't look good and so on at this point. But something like, either the Keys of Marinus or The Chase, right? Where you're going to have a different location every week, different stars and so on. And, these are big asks of TV production in the 60s that doesn't really have the budget for it. And they're like, let's go for it anyway. I mean, that's a very Terry Nation thing, right? And like, oh yeah, let's do a whole world-ending thing, and like giant devastation of London and so on. Big ideas, and let's just try, right? And so I think like the new series is a little bit more cautious, probably sensibly so. So you're not going to get these like I think like you don't have these really awful episodes of the new series that everybody mocks. Even the worst ones are perfectly competent television, right? That they're just, a few things didn't work, but they're not like these like, oh my god, everything went so awfully wrong that we just have a drinking party and make fun of it, like you have with some classic series episodes. But I think on the flip side, you don't get this kind of like just huge ambition that we're just going to pull off anyway, because like Arnold said, like sometimes you do have these happy accidents where things work out beautifully.
Let's see. And with some of the spin-offs, like with the audio dramas, it depends again on the license. See, with nowadays they still have a script editor at BBC, basically supervises the scripts at the Big Finish. Are you aware of?
Yeah,
I think they have to give script approval. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's also for the comics as well too. Yeah,
well, because it's more of a branding right now. So like, like in the old days, it was like, comics do whatever, it's like, they didn't care that much. But now I think they care a bit more. And also because it's an ongoing show too, they want to make sure they're not doing something that's going to, be showing up on TV, like, later in the year or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reverse is that the TV show doesn't care at all about anything. So like, for instance, as many fans find annoying if they're really into it. It's like Big Finish could tell you a big story about something, and if the TV show decides to tell a story that contradicts it, they don't care, because that's ancillary merchandise. So that doesn't matter. It's to the fans to worry about, oh no, now how do I reconcile these? But that doesn't matter, So
I mean, the BBC explicitly has a charter that says you cannot rely, like a viewer who is watching a TV show cannot be expected to pay for something, right? So ancillary merchandise explicitly cannot be used as kind of backstory. And they had this famously when Rose was aired. So they delayed publication of the Gallifrey Chronicles by several months because they didn't want people to feel they had to buy this book in order to watch the show, even though they really had nothing to do with each other. But just even this perception that like, oh, you might have to read the book and pay like $5 or whatever for this book was completely out because it violates the charter. So there's sort of there's a like, I think it's probably in some ways sensible not to care, because there's so much Doctor Who in so many different media these days. You'll be totally hamstrung if you did try and make it all work. On the other hand, they explicitly probably can't in a lot of places. Or if you do, it has to be pretty subtle.
And the new Target novelizations that are coming out, they're rewriting some of the, well, not rewriting, but adding to the story of like, well, Gary Ross is going to have the new Target novelization of the TV movie. Rob Shearman's going to have a new version of the Dalek. We've already had Twice Upon a Time and
Day of the Doctor.
Thank you.
Rose and Christmas Invasion. Yeah, I mean, novel's a very different thing, right? It's interesting seeing some of the TV writers who write novelizations. You see, like, Malcolm Hulke, writes for TV, and then he writes these amazing novels, and they're really rich, depthful novels. And then you get a brilliant writer like Robert Holmes, who writes amazing TV, and his Two Doctors novelization is so-so, like, or someone like Terrence Dicks, who actually, I think improves from, like, the TV's perfectly functional, but the novels, when he's really firing all cylinders, are really, really great. So it's just different medium and different strengths, I think, for different writers.
Right, and even with the new Target novels, like RTD's Rose really stretches out the Mickey's backstory and Rose's backstory and Jackie, so there's a greater context to it. And Moffat as much Moffat's Day of the Doctor, especially in ebook form, works because there's a lot of, they use hyperlinks, and it's not told in sequential order. I mean, it starts with chapter 8, and there's all sorts of, it's a really cool, but it's a real cool writing experience. So I think it's nice now, as a guy who grew up with the Target novelizations during the classic era, it's nice to have these new versions where it's not just retelling the same story. It's like almost giving the original writers a chance to either build on it, or new writers to go, here, play with this for a while. So it's really exciting to see.
And I think one of the cleverest things about the Day of the Doctor novelization is he never specifies like doctors by number or anything like that, right? It's not like, oh, this is the, you know, the 10th Doctor, this is the 11th and stuff. And yet you absolutely know who is who at any given time. And even when all three doctors are talking in the same scene, it is abundantly clear. And I was like, that is just such clever writing, right? Because, you know, in the Three Doctors novelization, like, you know, Jo in her head, she just numbers the doctors. She's like, I'm gonna call this one Doctor 2 and this, you know, and stuff. Whereas, like, you know, which is a great way to get out of the problem. But like Moffat is like, no, I'm taking this challenge clearly, and it's very, very well done. And so when you there's a great Douglas Adams quote, not the usual quote about writing and deadlines and stuff, but I'm thinking about, he said there's one where I think it's about him, but they said like he's the kind of writer who gets in deep and dirty into the engine so that the car will run really smoothly. And that to me has always been my goal as a writer. I'm like, I will spend a lot of time working and getting my hands all messy and so on, so that the engine of this output is beautiful, because I think that's what you need to do. And actually, I talked to Jamie Matheson, who wrote Mummy on the Orient Express. We did like a live commentary, and he was talking about like the process of building it up. And you know, you hit some point and you're like, oh, this isn't quite working. And it's like, right, then you go back to the drawing board, right? And then you basically have to restructure, not just kind of paper over this crack. Like that's how you actually get the real depthful writing happening. And I think sometimes the shortcuts are like, you're like, it doesn't quite work, but oh well, let's just hand wave around it or something. But I think viewers notice this after a while, especially, you know, I think literate, like intelligent viewers, like Doctor Who fans tend to be, who are reading a lot of codes into like writing and stuff. They're like, that didn't really fit there. And I think that's where you do have to go back and like completely kind of like rethink some things, because it really has to flow in order to be believable.
And we have another question in the chat. Eleanor is asking, how do you write the voices distinct enough so you can always tell who's talking? And she adds, I understand there's no easy answer.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes there are subtle ways of doing it. I mean, I guess that sounds like a question also that's like more for the page, obviously, because if you're performing, then that overcomes a lot of that. Because so the question is, how do you capture that in the page? And part of that is like, well, there's simple ways and there's more subtle ways, and the simple ways can sometimes be a trap. Like if someone has a particular kind of tick in their, you know, speech pattern or something, but the problem is you lean into that too much, and then that starts to seem a bit lazy and too predictable. Like, so the first thing I think of is you just write every other line that Colin says and just make it 3 times and make the letters get into all caps by the end and have him yelling everything. And it's like, yeah, you'll know who he is, but you can't keep doing that. And so, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, ultimately it isn't an easy answer. It's knowing if it's a character you created, well, you know the person, you're creating that person, so you have to build up that personality and figure what is it that makes that person seem the same all the time, how they react to things, maybe how they speak, what their attitude is to someone else in the story. And for characters like these that we know very well from decades and decades of television and other media, a lot of us might think we have a pretty good sense of that, and I guess some people do, you know, or you could translate that, but it's still work. You got to make sure you don't lean too much on easy answers with dialogue repetition, and just figure out a way to make that character seem true to their, that's not too high-minded, but also with a character like the Doctor, make sure the character stays true to the morality, the ethics of what that character would be. And ultimately, you got to also rely on the fact that your audience, your readership, might be bringing so much awareness of those characters to their reading that they're going to do part of the work for you too. And then the trick is just don't trip them up. Don't do anything that feels too wrong, so that they can put that character that they already have in their head on that page. So
I mean, I think this
One
is
of
where
the
fan
things-
writing really kind of kicks in, because we have templates, like, if we're writing, say a short story for a Big Finish thing, right? We already know the doctor, we know the actor, like we know how they sound, like we know the companions and so on. So you don't have to basically invent as many new characters that way. So you have, distinct voices, and like you say, Arnold, like the audience can help you out because they can kind of build that bridge, but also they will notice if you get it wrong, right? If you are too far away, like, it's not just like, oh, that's a quirk of this character that I just made up. It's like, no, that's just sounds nothing like the second Doctor, therefore the whole story collapses. So you do run that risk as well, I think. But it's true, it's for both the audience, like the audience who are reading it or whatever, experiencing it, they also have this background they can fall on, but so does the writer. So it's a bit easier on both accounts. Yeah, but if it's your own personal characters only, that's a harder sell, I think, and that's why I think a lot of like fan writing is easier, because you don't have to invent everything from the ground up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that helps me in terms of writing dialogue, and especially for character, is understanding, listen to conversations, but what are the rhythms of how they speak? Are they talking quietly? It helps with the Doctor because you can, the first Doctor, tends to be sounds a lot differently and speaks in a different rhythm and tone than the fourth Doctor or the ninth Doctor. And it's understanding kind of the, to mix metaphors, the music of how they speak or the music of how your character speaks can help. It turns your dialogue from simply, yes, I'm going to do this, to really revealing a lot about who they are.
I think that's an excellent way of looking at it too, by the way, because it's like there is a melody, a rhythm that I think, particularly when it's a character you're familiar with, how that sounds and how the flow of someone speaking goes. You could capture that a lot better. And we're familiar with that rhythm from a lot of these characters.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got a question from Sammy Cat. Have any of you all listened to Eric Saward's recentish novelization of Resurrection of the Daleks, read by Terry Malloy? And if so, what are your thoughts?
I read the book. I thought it was the worst book I have ever read.
I was like,
I cannot believe what I'm reading. This is published. So I don't know if the audiobook is a bit better, but yes, I was. I mean, it's kind of like, it's the Plan 9 from outer space of Doctor Who novelizations. I'm like, this is so bad. It's amazing. I couldn't put it down.
Now I want to read it.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but when I watch the DVD, the DVD is the only one I know where the production notes troll the actual episode. So I'm not sure I want to read the novel version.
Wow.
So were
there's
there
the
any?
answer.
Haven't had the courage to read Revelation yet, so who knows how that's going to go.
Now I'm really intrigued by both of these.
So are there any points I haven't mentioned, we haven't covered, that you wanted to bring up? Since we don't have anything else in the chat, panelists, because we're getting close to the end of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think writing is, like, it serves several purposes, right? Like, some of it is just, I think, like Gordon said before, like, you could just write very flatly and be like, yes, I'm just doing this to kind of get the next plot development and so on. And there are some writers who basically do that, and sometimes they do it with a bit more flair, a bit less flair. But other times, I think your writing itself is the poetry, right? And you want to basically, like, this is what is really, as you say, like making the melody and making it sing. And if you can get that right, I mean, people will love you forever, right? It's like, this is an amazing way to touch people through this skill, which not everyone has. And for me, I mean, I found I much preferred nonfiction to fiction. I was like, the fiction stuff, I have a few things published as fiction. I was like, I can do it, but man, is it hard work. Like, it is an enormous struggle to do fiction. And I feel like I can do it and it's okay. Like, but I found with nonfiction, I was like, oh, I love this. And I found I was much more talented at nonfiction. So I was like, oh, I'm going to lean into that. And I also find, like, you can have a lot more jokes that way that, don't feel forced, at least the way I was writing them and stuff. So it's kind of like, finding your strengths, I think, is a really key part if you want to be a writer. It's like, what is going to work?
I've spent the last several years teaching exclusively now first-year composition, college composition courses, and one of the things I always rely on to get them started. First, I always use pop culture stuff to get them motivated. So we'll, like, you know, watch an episode of Star Trek and now do your paper and that kind of thing. And the idea, of course, is get them dealing with critical thinking as well.
Mhm.
But one of the things we always talk about is nonfiction, fiction. It's true, there's a lot of differences, obviously, but on a certain level, particularly when you're trying to get kids motivated to write, one of the things I rely on is saying to them that everything is storytelling. On a certain level, all writing is storytelling. And they unfortunately come to it sometimes because essentially what they're writing often is nonfiction, right? They're writing a paper about a piece of history or a commentary on something. It's nonfiction. But the point is, it is still a narrative. You're still taking people through a story with a beginning, middle, and end. You still have characters. You still have a plot. And that seems to help a lot of people to wrap their head around the idea that essentially all writing on a certain level is storytelling and is sharing a journey with someone, a narrative journey. And so getting that sense of how a story is told, I think some of us that are steeped in loving this kind of stuff, I think we get to feel we have an idea of what works and what doesn't. Some of us, you know, develop the ability maybe to apply that as well. But I think that's a great way of looking at it, particularly for people that want to write, is the idea that don't ever think of course, publishing nonfiction, I care about it a great deal. Don't ever think that that's, you know, any lesser or any different in a certain respect, because you are still a storyteller. You're still sharing a narrative with someone. And that's the one thing I would add, I guess.
Actually, I have two major questions I always ask people who send things in to me for outside ins or whatever, but actually including for like academic papers and stuff like that. So quite different kinds of writing. I say number one is, where does this actually begin? Because a lot of people begin at a totally different spot. Either they begin too late because they haven't told you key stuff, or they begin usually way too early and tell you stuff you don't need to know. Like, it's like, no, your piece starts in paragraph 3. Get rid of the first 2 paragraphs entirely. Right. And the thing is, you know, you're not married to them, delete them. Like, this, just be ruthless and cut them. And the other thing, which I think is the most important one, is what do we learn that we didn't know? Right. And that is, to me, the absolute driver of it. Right. And whether that's nonfiction or fiction or whatever, what is the point of this? Right. And if you're just doing the same old in whatever medium you're doing, why are you doing this? Right. And it just means you haven't finished yet. You haven't answered that question. Okay, keep thinking, go away and find an answer to it, and then come back, tell us something we didn't know. You know, and maybe it's a joke that I just found funny because, you know, surprise is part of it, right? That's fine. Maybe it's a really deep insight. That's great, right? You know, whatever it is, but you need to find something that is original. And, you know, like the Terrence Dicks quote, right? It doesn't have to be your original idea, but, you know, it kind of does, though.
Yeah, I would
Really
say.
briefly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would say I have my 2 pieces of advice would be: 1, read a lot, read fiction, read nonfiction, read more than just web articles, because you need to understand, you know, understanding how language works can help in shaping how you write prose, how you write for television, etc. And I also think whenever you interact with media, lean back and Gene Roddenberry did this before he became a TV writer. Was he'd watch a show and take notes as to, here's how it's structured. He'd turn his back and listen to hear how dialogue went. Because if you can understand how some of the fundamentals work, especially in prose, that can help you, because there are tons of books about how to write a novel in 30 days. You get them free on Kindle, they're worth the price. But understanding kind of that basic structure, you can bring your own flavor and your own insight into it. And that makes for much stronger storytelling.
And we're out of time. So thank you, panelists. And if you are currently watching this, please like this video and subscribe to our page. Council Room is happening virtually January 15th through the 17th. Find out all the things that are happening by visiting our webpage, www.council-room.com. And thank you, panelists. Thank you, whoever are watching.